In a quiet and cozy town, located in a picturesque corner of the state, a tragedy occurs that shakes the entire local community. The beginning of the story draws attention to the Walker family, apparently idyllic at first glance, but hiding dark secrets behind closed doors. Elizabeth Walker, a middle-aged woman known for her charity work and active participation in public life, is at the center of this story. Her husband, Richard Walker, a successful businessman, seems to be a model family man. Their adopted son, Daniel, a student at a local college, is loved and respected by everyone. But not everything is as simple as it seems. The investigation begins on the morning of October 23rd, when Richard Walker's body was found in his own home. Death was caused by multiple blows with a heavy object. Police officer John Hardy arrives at the crime scene to begin collecting evidence. From the first minutes, he encounters mysteries. There are no visible signs of forced entry. The house is in perfect order, except for one room, Richard's office. Officer Hardy conducts a preliminary examination of the crime scene, noting every detail that may indicate the events of that night. There are traces of blood on the floor and upside-down photographs of the family on the table, which may indicate a struggle or altercation before Richard's death. The Walker family's neighbors, Sarah Green and Michael Jones, share their observations. Sarah claims to have noticed tension between Richard and Elizabeth recently, while Michael adds that he heard loud noises and screams coming from the Walker house the night before the murder. Elizabeth and Daniel show shock and grief at the loss of Richard, but John Hardy senses that each of them may be hiding something important. He decides to take a closer look at their alibis, as well as analyze their personal belongings, which may provide clues to solving the case. After an initial examination of the crime scene, Officer John Hardy begins to delve deeper into the Walker family life to understand who Elizabeth, Daniel, and Richard are, and what could have led to the tragic outcome. Elizabeth Walker was always in the public eye. She was known as a devoted wife and mother, active in charities and the social life of the town. Locals admired her energy and selflessness. Elizabeth came from a modest family, but her marriage to Richard brought her to a more privileged position. Her life seemed perfect, but those who knew her better noticed her restlessness and fatigue. Elizabeth often retreated into seclusion, and although she continued to smile and maintain her usual image, one could see the shadow of an unspeakable burden in her eyes. Richard Walker was a goal-oriented and successful man. His building materials company was making a significant profit, and he was a respected man in the town. However, his business acumen and ambition often alienated him from his family. Richard was strict and demanding both in business and at home. His relationship with Elizabeth had become strained in recent years, which did not go unnoticed by his closest friends and neighbors. The family increasingly had quarrels, which could be caused by both domestic problems and something more serious. Behind the outward mask of a successful entrepreneur was a man who may have felt insecure and lonely in his own family. Daniel Walker, an adopted son, was adopted into the Walker family when he was 5 years old. His biological parents died in a car accident, and Richard and Elizabeth, having no children of their own, decided to adopt the boy. From childhood, Daniel was quiet and withdrawn, but at the same time showed an extraordinary ability to learn. He was the child that everyone loved, but no one really understood. At school, Daniel stood out for his intellectual maturity and quiet but confident demeanor. However, despite his outward well-being, a feeling of alienation and inferiority lurked inside him, which intensified during his teenage years. His relationship with Richard was complicated. Daniel saw him as both a strict mentor and a person who did not understand him. Over the years, as Daniel grew older, his affection for Elizabeth grew. She was his comfort and support in difficult times, but over time their relationship became more than just maternal care. Elizabeth, feeling lonely and misunderstood in her marriage to Richard, began to see Daniel not only as a son, but as a man to whom she was drawn. Their interactions became increasingly emotional, and their mutual support evolved into something more intimate. Sarah Green and Michael Jones, the Walkers' closest neighbors, had known the family for many years. Sarah and Elizabeth communicated frequently, although their friendship was never very close. Sarah intuitively sensed that Elizabeth was hiding something, but did not attach much importance to it. Michael, on the other hand, was more neutral and more interested in Richard, with whom he sometimes discussed business and current events. They both noticed changes in Richard and Elizabeth's behavior, but could not imagine that it would lead to such a terrible outcome. Officer Hardy, studying the personal files of the Walker family, begins to piece together a picture of their lives. It becomes clear to him that the family was not as prosperous as they seemed. Carefully examining photographs, letters, and other personal items, he notes the growing tension and rift between Richard and Elizabeth, as well as the noticeable closeness between Elizabeth and Daniel. He begins to suspect that there are deeper feelings and ulterior motives at work in this case. As Officer John Hardy delves deeper into the details of the Walker family's lives, he begins to see not just the surface cracks, but the deep, hidden fractures that were slowly destroying the family from the inside. More and more evidence and testimony point to something more serious going on inside the home than just family squabbles. Richard Walker, according to his neighbors, had changed noticeably in recent months. Michael Jones, who often met him on his morning jogs, noticed that Richard was becoming increasingly withdrawn and irritable. He began to avoid socializing, often skipping out on dates with friends, and even stopped going to his favorite golf club. Michael remembers Richard once admitting that something was wrong in his family, but refusing to go into detail. Hardy records this testimony, realizing that Richard was on the verge of doing something or learning something that would change everything. Elizabeth, meanwhile, appeared to be stable on the outside, but her behavior had also changed. Sarah Green recalls how a few weeks ago, Elizabeth suddenly stopped organizing the charity events that had always been important to her. She stopped socializing with her neighbors and left the house less and less, preferring to spend time alone or in Daniel's company. Sarah even tried to find out what was going on, but Elizabeth only dryly replied that she was simply too busy. Meanwhile, Daniel was also showing signs of anxiety. Hardy noted that his school records showed a decline in grades and attendance in recent months. Some of his friends said he was becoming increasingly withdrawn and avoiding talking about his family. Daniel stopped attending his usual clubs and sports, instead spending time on the computer or outside the home, sometimes even late into the night. He was increasingly alone with his thoughts, and no one could figure out what was bothering him. As Officer Hardy pieces together these details, he begins to form a clearer picture of what is happening. He comes to the conclusion that the Walker family was beset by tensions caused not only by external problems, but also by internal conflicts. One of the key pieces of evidence is the CCTV footage from the cameras around the Walker home. Hardy notices that in the weeks leading up to the murder, Richard repeatedly checked the footage, focusing on footage of Daniel and Elizabeth together. He watched these videos alone, in the quiet of his office. In one of the videos, Hardy sees a moment where Richard accidentally bumps into Daniel in the hallway of their home. The interaction between them was tense. Richard looked at Daniel with suspicion, while Daniel averted his eyes as if hiding something. In addition, the same recordings show Richard leaving home for several hours on the day of the murder, shortly before the tragedy. Hardy realizes that this time could be critical to clarifying the circumstances of the case. He begins to investigate where Richard was and who he may have been in contact with. But the results are still unclear. Elizabeth and Daniel, according to their friends and acquaintances, tried to maintain a semblance of normality, but they were getting worse and worse at it. Some witnesses recall seeing them together in unexpected places, where mother and son should not have been together. The glances they exchanged were too long and too deep for a normal family relationship. Sarah Green remembers one particular incident. Late one night, about a week before the murders, she saw Daniel and Elizabeth in a car near their home. They sat in silence, and then Elizabeth suddenly leaned toward Daniel, and they talked for a long time. It was too intimate a moment for a normal mother-son conversation. Sarah was hesitant to tell anyone about it, but now looking back on it, she realizes there was an ominous tension to it. Officer Hardy, analyzing all these events, comes to the conclusion that the relationships in the Walker family were much more complex and disturbing than anyone could have imagined. He begins to understand that Richard was not just a strict father and husband, but a man who could feel a threat to his position in the family. Hardy suspects that Richard began to realize that something terrible was happening, but was unable to prevent the tragedy. This part of the script lays the groundwork for what will happen next, opening the viewer's eyes to hidden aspects of the Walkers' lives. With each new piece of evidence and each new revelation, Officer Hardy is further immersed in the dark truth that lies at the heart of this family, gradually realizing that he must unravel a complex web of lies, passion, and betrayal. After discovering the first signs of a secret relationship between Elizabeth and Daniel, Officer John Hardy begins to actively investigate what exactly was happening in the Walker family in the last months before the tragedy. His initial suspicions are confirmed by new evidence and testimony that brings deeply hidden secrets to the surface. Hardy's first step is a detailed analysis of the surveillance footage captured in and around the Walker home. Despite initial hesitation, the officer decides to pay close attention to the small details that may seem insignificant at first glance. He watches hundreds of hours of video, trying to capture the subtleties of interactions between the family members. He pays particular attention to the nights when Richard is away and Daniel and Elizabeth are alone. The footage shows Elizabeth and Daniel sitting together in the living room for hours, talking or simply staring at each other in silence. Hardy notes the moments when their conversations turn more intimate, their bodies come closer, and the tension between them becomes palpable. These images become key clues in the investigation. They show that the relationship between Elizabeth and Daniel has long since gone beyond the ordinary family. However, this is not enough to draw definitive conclusions, and Hardy realizes that he needs more information to connect the dots and understand how this relationship led to Richard's death. Officer Hardy now begins interviewing witnesses in more depth. He interviews Sarah Green and Michael Jones again, but this time he asks more specific questions. Sarah, who had previously tried to avoid giving detailed descriptions of what she had seen, now begins to open up. She describes seeing Daniel and Elizabeth in more than friendly embraces on several occasions, which she found strange and inappropriate. She recalls how one evening, while out walking the dog, she spotted the two of them in the garden, standing too close to each other. As if oblivious to the possibility of being seen, they looked as if nothing else mattered. Michael Jones, in turn, talks about a conversation he had with Richard a few days before his death. Richard was clearly agitated and tense, and mentioned that he suspected something was wrong in his home, but he didn't want to go into details. Michael didn't pay any attention to it at the time, thinking that Richard was simply overworked. Now, recalling those words, he understands that his friend was on the verge of discovering something terrible. Hardy begins to realize that Richard may have already known, or at least suspected, what was going on between his wife and adopted son. This suspicion is only reinforced when Hardy finds searches on Richard's computer for how to spot a cheater and articles on recognizing the signs of infidelity. This discovery leads Hardy to believe that Richard has begun his own investigation within his family, trying to understand what is going on behind his back. But what could have prompted Richard to think like this? Hardy decides to check Richard's personal belongings, especially his phone. After receiving permission to access his data, Hardy discovers that in the last weeks of his life, Richard was actively corresponding with a private investigator he hired to monitor his family. In one of his final messages, Richard tells the detective that he has received confirmation of my worst fears, and that he now needs to decide what to do with this information. These messages become a key element in revealing the motive for the murder. Richard was ready to expose the secret affair between Elizabeth and Daniel, but did not have time to do so. His death was the culmination of pent-up tension and fear of inevitable exposure. Meanwhile, Hardy continues to probe the relationship between Elizabeth and Daniel. He calls them in for a second interrogation, this time asking more direct questions. Daniel, initially cool, begins to show signs of nervousness. He gives confused answers to questions, and his version of events does not match the testimony of other witnesses. Hardy uses this moment to put psychological pressure on him, confronting him with facts that are difficult to refute. Daniel tries to deny his relationship with Elizabeth, but as Hardy uncovers more evidence, his defense weakens. Elizabeth, in turn, behaves more reservedly. She tries to remain calm, but her eyes betray an internal struggle. Hardy senses that she is on the verge of an emotional breakdown and tries to use this to his advantage. He mentions the letters, photographs, and videos he found that testify to her relationship with Daniel. Elizabeth, realizing that her secrets can no longer remain hidden, begins to show signs of despair. At the end of this part of the investigation, Hardy obtains the crucial piece of evidence. He discovers Richard's personal diary, in which he details his observations of Elizabeth and Daniel's behavior. The diary also contains Richard's plans for divorce and for Elizabeth to lose all rights to her property and custody of Daniel. In the final entry, Richard writes of his intention to speak to Elizabeth on the very evening he was killed. This discovery confirms the motive for the murder. Elizabeth and Daniel, realizing that their relationship will be exposed and that they could lose everything, decide to get rid of Richard before he can put his plans into action. Hardy is now confident in his findings, but understands that he still has a lot of work to do to bring the case to an end and bring the perpetrators to justice. With all the key evidence and testimony gathered, Officer John Hardy begins to feel like he is getting closer to solving this dark and twisted story. But to fully understand how the tragedy happened, he must reconstruct the events of that fateful night. This task requires his utmost concentration and meticulous attention to detail, because this is where the truth lies that has been hidden for so long. The night of the murder began, like so many others, with apparent calm in the Walker household. But that evening, emotions were raging inside each member of the family. Richard, now fully convinced that his wife and son had cheated, was determined to end the situation once and for all. Hardy finds CCTV footage of Richard entering his office at 8:45 p.m. and then emerging minutes later with what appeared to be divorce papers and evidence of Elizabeth's infidelity. He decides that this night will be the end of their relationship. Elizabeth, meanwhile, is sitting in the living room, trying to concentrate on her book, but her mind is elsewhere. She knows that Richard has found out, and she senses that he is about to be exposed. She is mentally preparing herself for a conversation that she suspects could turn into something terrible. Daniel, sitting in his room, also senses the tension in the house. He knows that he and Elizabeth have gone too far, and now it could all end in disaster. Richard leaves his office and heads into the living room where Elizabeth is sitting. He has a folder of documents in his hands, and his eyes are determined. He stands in front of her, throws the folder on the table, and demands an explanation. The moment is captured on video, their faces full of anger and disappointment. Richard opens the folder and begins to list everything he has learned. The secret meetings, Elizabeth's reluctance to spend time with him, their frequent disagreements. He places photographs and documents on the table that confirm his suspicions and says that all of this will be used against her in court. Elizabeth begins to defend herself, her voice shaking with fear and anger. She tries to justify herself, saying that Richard himself is to blame for the failure of their marriage, that he was never truly there for her. But Richard is adamant. He intends to get his way, full custody of Daniel, and depriving Elizabeth of all rights to the property. In their conversation, the tension mounts to the limit, and soon the argument escalates into a heated quarrel. At this point, Daniel, hearing the screams, comes out of his room. He sees Richard and Elizabeth standing opposite each other, almost touching, their faces distorted with anger. He tries to intervene, to separate them, but this only makes the situation worse. Richard turns sharply to him and accuses him of betrayal, calling him not a son, but an outsider who destroyed their family. These words awaken in Daniel a surge of emotions that he has long suppressed. Remembering all his years of loneliness and feelings of inadequacy, he begins to shout at Richard, accusing him of never being a real father. The argument turns physical. Richard, blinded by anger, tries to hit Daniel, who dodges and pushes him away. Elizabeth watches in panic, her heart torn between her love for her son and her sense of responsibility to her husband. At that moment, she realizes that if Richard survives, their lives will be ruined. Overwhelmed by emotion, she suddenly grabs the nearest heavy object, a figurine on the mantelpiece, and hits Richard on the head. He falls to the floor, unconscious. Daniel, seeing this, is shocked by what has happened, but at the same time he realizes that there is no way back. Richard cannot stay alive, otherwise they will face prison and endless condemnation. In panic and despair, he decides to finish what he started. He takes the same statue and strikes several more times, which become fatal. Richard's blood spills on the floor, and his body remains motionless. Elizabeth and Daniel stand over the body, their breath hitched, their minds filled with the horror of what they have done. They realize that they have just done something irreparable. The world around them is crumbling, and the future is murky and frightening. At this point, Elizabeth, still in shock, makes a decision. She tells Daniel that they must do everything they can to cover up the crime and avoid punishment. Together, they begin frantically cleaning up the evidence, wiping away the blood, hiding the weapon, thinking about how they can explain Richard's disappearance. All this happens under the cover of night, and their every step is dictated by fear and desperation. Meanwhile, as Elizabeth and Daniel try to cover up their crime, Hardy's investigation begins to reveal more and more that the family's conflict ran much deeper than just marital discord. Each new witness and piece of evidence points to something darker and more dangerous at work than anyone could have imagined. Hardy begins to suspect that the tragedy was not a random outburst of anger, but the result of a long-standing and deeply hidden conflict that eventually exploded with devastating force. The situation becomes even more complicated when Hardy learns that Daniel, contrary to his initial testimony, was actually at home on the night of the murder. His alibi begins to crumble, and Hardy realizes that the key to solving this crime lies in the dynamics between Elizabeth and Daniel. This moment becomes the culmination of the entire investigation. Hardy feels that he is getting closer to the solution, but he needs to put together the last pieces of the puzzle to understand what exactly happened that fateful night. He knows that difficult decisions and possibly dangerous consequences lie ahead, but he is ready to see it through to the end, despite all the difficulties. The murder of Richard Walker becomes the central topic in a small town, and locals anxiously follow every step of the investigation. Officer John Hardy, having collected a lot of evidence and testimony, understands that he is faced with the most difficult stage: to put together all the fragments of this tangled story and prove who is really behind this crime. Hardy begins by re-interviewing all the key witnesses. He takes particular care in interviewing Elizabeth and Daniel. Despite her best efforts, Elizabeth appears increasingly vulnerable. Her outward reserve begins to crack under the weight of the evidence and Hardy's questions. She repeatedly claims to know nothing about what happened, but her answers become increasingly confused, and her attempts to justify herself seem unconvincing. Daniel, in turn, shows signs of extreme stress. The young man, who was once confident in his abilities, now appears depressed and confused. Hardy notices that his answers to questions increasingly diverge from his initial testimony. In particular, Daniel begins to get confused about where he was on the night of the murder and who else was in the house at that time. The officer decides it is time to use more aggressive interrogation techniques. He begins asking direct questions about the nature of Elizabeth and Daniel's relationship, hinting that he knows about their secret affair. Elizabeth tries to remain calm, but Hardy sees her hands begin to shake and her eyes fill with fear. Daniel, hearing these questions, reacts sharply. His voice becomes tense and he tries to change the subject, which only confirms Hardy's suspicions. At the same time, Hardy continues to collect additional evidence. He conducts a detailed inspection of the Walker house, in particular, Richard's office. There he finds important clues that had previously gone unnoticed. In one of the desk drawers, he discovers a hidden flash drive containing audio files, Richard's personal diary entries. In these entries, Richard details his suspicions, how he began to notice strange changes in Elizabeth and Daniel's behavior. He describes how he tried to follow them, check their phone calls and correspondence. In one of the audio files, Richard speaks of his intention to meet with a private detective to discuss further steps. These recordings become decisive evidence that Richard really intended to expose his wife and adopted son, and that his murder could have been planned precisely with the purpose of concealing this secret affair. At the same time, Hardy receives the results of a forensic examination that analyzed traces of blood found at the crime scene. The experts confirm that the murder weapon, a statuette, contains the fingerprints of both Elizabeth and Daniel. This discovery finally destroys their alibi and shows that both were involved in this crime. Meanwhile, Hardy continues to search for witnesses who might shed light on the events of that night. He finds Sarah Green, who recalls another important moment. On the night of the murder, she was out for a walk with her dog as usual. As she passed the Walker house, she noticed a faint light coming from Richard's study. She thought she heard muffled voices, but at the time she didn't pay attention to it. Now, realizing the importance of this detail, she shares it with Hardy. This information allows Hardy to reconstruct the events of that night with even greater precision. He realizes that before the murder, Richard was in his study, perhaps preparing to speak with Elizabeth and Daniel. When they began arguing, the light in the study was still on, and their voices could have been heard outside the house. After the murder, the light was turned off to avoid attracting attention, confirming an intent to conceal the crime. Hardy decides it's time to take decisive action. He calls Elizabeth and Daniel in for a final interrogation, using all the evidence he's collected to confront them with the undeniable truth. He shows them the fingerprints, Richard's audio recordings, and tells them about Sarah Green's testimony. He openly states that their affair is no longer a secret, and that all the information he's collected points to their guilt. Elizabeth, at her wit's end, realizes there is no point in denying the obvious any longer. She tries to explain her actions by saying that she was driven to despair, that Richard was a tyrant who was ruining their lives. But Hardy makes it clear that this does not justify murder, and that they must now answer for their actions. Daniel, seeing his mother begin to crack under the weight of the evidence, also gives in. He confesses that he and Elizabeth planned the murder to avoid detection and preserve their secret. He tells how they tried to cover their tracks, how they planned every detail, hoping that the police would consider it an accidental murder or self-defense. But they did not take into account one thing: the persistence of Officer Hardy, who managed to unravel their plan. After the confession, Hardy arrests Elizabeth and Daniel. This becomes an important step in closing the case, but the investigation is not over yet. Hardy understands that he has to prepare for the trial, where he will have to present all the evidence he has collected to achieve a fair punishment for the perpetrators. Meanwhile, the town continues to discuss this tragedy. Locals are shocked by what happened. No one could imagine that such dark secrets were hidden behind the facade of a prosperous family. Sarah Green and Michael Jones, as the closest friends of the Walker family, feel betrayed and confused. They have to come to terms with the fact that they did not notice the true state of affairs in their friend's house for so long. Hardy, having completed this stage of the investigation, understands that this case will become one of the most difficult and significant in his career. He realizes that even the most prosperous families at first glance can hide terrible secrets, and that his task is not only to solve crimes, but also to be attentive to details that may seem insignificant at first glance. This part of the script emphasizes the complexity and intricacy of the case, showing how the investigation, step by step, brings Hardy closer to the truth. At the same time, it demonstrates the emotional tension and psychological pressure experienced by all participants in this tragedy, and leads the viewer to the inevitable trial, which will be the final point in this story. After the interrogations that led to the confessions, Officer John Hardy realizes that the real work has just begun. Although he has obtained confessions from Elizabeth and Daniel, he must legally establish their guilt and prepare a case for trial. This requires careful preparation, as defense attorneys may attempt to challenge both the confession itself and the evidence collected at the crime scene. Elizabeth and Daniel are arrested without resistance, but the town is thrown into shock and dismay. News that a mother and adopted son are involved in the murder of the head of the family spreads quickly, and public reaction becomes polarized. Some sympathize with Elizabeth, seeing her as a victim of domestic tyranny, while others condemn her and Daniel, calling them criminals unworthy of forgiveness. The local news coverage of the events begins to become increasingly emotional, adding fuel to the fire of public opinion. John Hardy, realizing that a difficult trial lies ahead, begins to prepare the case materials. He carefully studies all the collected evidence, records the testimony of witnesses, and conducts additional consultations with experts. His main task is to create an irrefutable indictment that will convince the court of the guilt of the accused. Hardy understands that the confession, although a key moment in the case, can be challenged by defense lawyers who will try to invalidate it due to psychological pressure or other factors. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Daniel find themselves in isolation, each locked in a separate cell awaiting trial. They enter a new, dark phase of their lives, where fear and uncertainty become their constant companions. Elizabeth, realizing that her actions led to the death of her husband and the destruction of her entire life, begins to sink into a deep depression. She often spends time alone, replaying the events of that fateful night in her head. Guilt and justification battle within her, and she increasingly thinks about what will happen next. Daniel, in turn, is also going through a difficult time. His whole life, his future, all of it is destroyed in one moment. He realizes that his relationship with Elizabeth was not only morally unacceptable, but also led to a tragedy that destroyed everything he knew and loved. He has to face the feeling of guilt that completely overwhelms him. In moments of despair, he tries to find justification for his actions, but each time he returns to the same thought: nothing can change what happened. Waiting for trial is also a torturous process for Hardy, who knows his actions will be scrutinized in the courtroom. He works day and night, preparing all the necessary documents and conducting additional witness interviews to strengthen his case. He also works with prosecutors to ensure that the case against Elizabeth and Daniel is presented as strongly as possible. Sarah Green and Michael Jones, the Walker family's closest neighbors, are also drawn into the process. They are called to testify in court. Sarah, feeling part of this tragedy as she was the one who noticed the change in Elizabeth's behavior, is experiencing an internal conflict. Her testimony could have a significant impact on the outcome of the case, and she realizes that her words could forever change the lives of those she once considered friends. Michael, for his part, also feels the pressure, but tries to remain calm, convincing himself that justice must prevail. When the case finally goes to trial, complex legal battles begin. Defense lawyers attempt to portray Elizabeth as a victim of domestic violence, arguing that she acted in a fit of passion to protect herself and her son from Richard's tyranny. They raise questions about how much the pressure Elizabeth was under may have affected her ability to make rational decisions. Daniel is also portrayed as a young man caught between two fires, who was forced to act under pressure from his mother. Defense lawyers focus on his young age and psycho-emotional state, arguing that he could not fully understand the consequences of his actions. But Hardy and the prosecutors have prepared a powerful case. They present surveillance footage, audio files found on a flash drive, and other compelling evidence that proves Elizabeth and Daniel's actions were premeditated. The confession elicited during interrogation also plays a major role in the case, although the defense has sought to cast doubt on it. The trial becomes a real test for all participants. Each hearing is attended by representatives of the press and the public, who closely follow the developments. Journalists publish articles analyzing every aspect of the case, which further fuels interest and polarizes opinions in society. Some believe that Elizabeth and Daniel deserve severe punishment, while others see them as victims of circumstances. As the trial continues, Hardy faces personal doubts. Although he is firmly convinced of his position, he is forced to confront moral dilemmas. He reflects on what led to such a terrible outcome and realizes that the situation is much more complex than it seems at first glance. He sees how a family that seemed prosperous and happy collapsed under the pressure of hidden passions and conflicts that no one noticed until the tragedy. This part of the script focuses on the legal and moral side of the case, showing how the investigation and trial process affects not only the accused, but everyone involved in the tragedy. Officer Hardy continues to pursue his line, determined to achieve justice, but he also faces internal questions that force him to rethink the nature of justice and human relationships. As the trial finally reaches its climax, the tension in the courtroom is unbearable. Each participant understands that this day will determine their fate and leave an indelible mark on their lives. Elizabeth and Daniel sit in the dock, their faces expressing a mixture of fear, despair, and resignation. For them, this is the moment of truth, when their entire past and future comes down to the verdict that the court will render. The prosecutor begins his closing argument by presenting all the evidence he has collected into a single unbreakable thread. He paints Richard Walker as the victim of a cruel plot, initiated and carried out by his own wife and adopted son. The prosecutor emphasizes that Richard, although strict and demanding, did not deserve this outcome, and his murder was an act of deliberate violence aimed at covering up a criminal affair. He focuses on the motives of Elizabeth and Daniel, their attempts to deceive justice, and the destruction of the family they were supposed to protect. The prosecutor presents audio recordings, CCTV footage, and confessions from the defendants as irrefutable evidence of their guilt. He leaves no room for doubt that Richard's murder was carefully planned and committed with a clear understanding of the consequences. The prosecutor demands the maximum punishment to show that such crimes cannot go unpunished. Defense attorneys try to garner sympathy from the jury, by highlighting the complex circumstances that led Elizabeth and Daniel to their tragic decision. They portray Elizabeth as a woman who was stymied by years of emotional and psychological abuse at the hands of Richard, and who they believe acted in a fit of passion. They portray Daniel as a young man who was influenced by his mother and unable to cope with the pressures of the situation. The defense emphasizes that the killing was not premeditated, but the result of an escalating conflict that could perhaps have been prevented had the family situation been different. The defense is focusing on Daniel's mental state, arguing that his youth and emotional instability played a key role in his actions. They bring in experts who say his depression was caused by long-term stress and strained family relationships. The defense is trying to convince the jury that Daniel does not deserve a harsh sentence and that he needs help, not jail time. Elizabeth's testimony becomes the emotional climax of the trial. She decides to take the stand in court to try to explain her actions. Elizabeth, with tears in her eyes, recounts how her marriage to Richard gradually fell apart, how she felt alone and misunderstood. She admits that her relationship with Daniel was a mistake, that they were both confused in their feelings and unable to cope with the situation. Elizabeth tries to justify her actions, but also expresses remorse for what happened. She asks for leniency, claiming that she never wanted things to end this way. Daniel also gives his final statement. His voice trembles as he expresses his guilt and remorse for what he has done. He admits that he failed to confront his emotions and feelings for Elizabeth, and that their relationship led to the destruction of his family. Daniel apologizes to everyone he has let down, especially his father, whose life he took. He asks the jury to consider his youth and difficult emotional state when they reach their verdict. Once both sides have concluded their arguments, the judge addresses the jury, instructing them that their job is to evaluate the evidence presented and decide whether the defendants are guilty of murdering Richard Walker. He reminds them that they must act impartially, based solely on the facts, and not be influenced by any emotions that may have arisen during the trial. The jury retires to consider its verdict, and the courtroom falls silent and expectant. Officer Hardy, sitting in the courtroom, has mixed feelings. On the one hand, he is confident that the evidence gathered leaves no doubt as to Elizabeth and Daniel's guilt. On the other hand, he knows that this case has ruined the lives of everyone involved, and that no verdict can bring back what has been lost. Finally, the jury returns to the courtroom. The foreman rises and announces the verdict. Elizabeth and Daniel are found guilty of the murder of Richard Walker. The judge announces the sentences, determining prison terms for each defendant. Elizabeth receives life in prison without the possibility of parole, given her leading role in the crime and the premeditation of her actions. Daniel, given his young age and emotional state, receives 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The reaction in the courtroom is mixed. There is some sympathy for Daniel, especially from his friends and acquaintances, who believe he was guided by his feelings and his mother. Others, especially those who knew Richard, believe the verdict is fair and are satisfied that justice has been done. Journalists and the public continue to debate the case, publishing articles and reports expressing different opinions on the fairness of the verdict. For Hardy, this conclusion to the case is a difficult moment. Although he has achieved his goal of punishing the guilty, there is no sense of satisfaction. He realizes that there were no winners in this case, and that the broken Walker family will remain in the city's memory as a tragic reminder of how hidden passions and conflicts can lead to disaster. Elizabeth and Daniel, each in their own way, begin their lives anew in prison, realizing that they have a long road ahead of them to atone for their actions. Elizabeth, left alone in a prison cell, understands that she will now have to live with the burden of guilt for the rest of her days. Daniel, realizing his youth and the opportunity to start all over again after many years, decides to try to find the strength in himself to fix his life, despite the difficult conditions of imprisonment. The town where the tragedy occurred is gradually returning to normal life, but the memory of the Walker family remains forever. People discuss the case as an example of how destructive forces can hide behind external well-being, and how important it is to notice the signs of impending disaster in time. With the Walker convictions, life in the town is beginning to return to normal, but the echoes of the tragedy continue to resonate in the hearts and minds of people. Although the perpetrators were brought to justice, for many, the case remains a painful reminder of how easily even the most seemingly strong family can crumble. Elizabeth Walker, serving her life sentence, finds herself in a state of deep depression. Every day in her prison cell reminds her of that fateful night when she did something irreparable. Elizabeth immerses herself in her thoughts, pondering every action, every moment that led to Richard's death. Psychologists visit her periodically, but their help is not enough to rid her of the oppressive feeling of guilt. Her letter, written several months after the start of her term, in which she asks for forgiveness from Richard's family and her son, remains unanswered. With each passing day, Elizabeth becomes more and more distant from reality, immersed in endless thoughts about what could have been if she had made different decisions. Daniel Walker, although he received a lesser sentence, also feels the weight of his crime. In prison, he faces harsh realities that only increase his feelings of isolation and despair. Unlike his mother, Daniel tries to find a way to cope with what happened. He begins attending prison classes, participating in support groups where he shares his story and listens to the stories of other prisoners. For him, this becomes a way to find redemption and perhaps find meaning in a life that is far from over. He writes letters to Elizabeth, but receives no answers, which only intensifies his internal struggle. Over time, Daniel decides to dedicate himself to self-improvement, realizing that despite his crime, he can still try to fix his life. The town where the tragedy took place is also changing. People who knew the Walkers are beginning to realize how little they really knew about what was going on behind closed doors. Articles appear in the local press, analyzing how such events can happen in a community that considers itself prosperous. Social services are beginning to work more actively with the families to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Teachers in schools are paying more attention to the emotional state of their students, and neighbors are becoming more attentive to each other, trying to prevent a repeat of this. Officer John Hardy returns to his regular job, but the Walker case leaves a deep mark on him. He finds the investigation to be one of the most challenging of his career, not only because of the complexities of the facts, but because of the moral dilemmas he faced. Hardy often thinks back to the family, wondering if the tragedy could have been prevented if someone had recognized the signs of crisis sooner. He becomes more involved in local domestic violence prevention programs, using his experience to help other officers and residents better understand how to recognize and prevent similar situations. Sarah Green and Michael Jones, the Walkers' next-door neighbors, also suffer the consequences of the incident. Sarah, realizing that she could have seen the signs of trouble earlier, and that her silence contributed greatly to the tragedy, begins volunteering with a local organization that helps families in crisis. She hopes that by doing so, she can atone for her guilt and prevent similar incidents in the future. Michael, for his part, becomes more withdrawn, realizing how close he was to the tragedy and how little he could have done to prevent it. For him, the incident becomes a lesson in how sometimes you need to be more attentive to those around you. A memorial to Richard Walker is erected in a local church. It becomes a place where people come to pray and remember not only Richard, but all the shattered lives that were touched by this tragedy. The memorial is engraved with the words, "In memory of the importance of loving and protecting each other so that we do not lose what is most precious." Years have passed, and this incident has become part of the city's history. People continue to live, but the memories of the Walker family remain forever in their hearts. This story has become not only a tragedy, but also an important lesson for the entire community, reminding us how important it is to be attentive and caring towards our loved ones, not allowing hidden passions and conflicts to ruin lives. Hardy, having completed this case, understands that his job is not only to solve crimes, but also to prevent them. He continues his service, but each time he encounters similar situations, he remembers the Walker family and that nothing in this life can be taken for granted.